You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This is part 9 in the series on thinking rationally, and this week's episode is about thinking rationally about ethics or morality. Can there be such a thing as a rational code of ethics? Are ethics objective? Can you use your reason to determine right from wrong? I would answer yes to all those questions, and in fact, I've already done a series on exactly this subject. The series is called Your Own Moral Compass, and it was in previous episodes 151 to 153 of The Voluntary Life. So if you're interested in a discussion about how you can identify your own moral compass using rational thinking, then I recommend checking out those 3 episodes because I've really gone into a lot of detail about this subject in those episodes. And given that I've already done that, I thought that in this episode, rather than repeat that content, I'd give a bit of background to the history of thinking rationally about ethics and to some of the confusions and contradictions and arguments that take place when people try to think rationally about ethics. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to a short video by the philosopher Michael Huemer that I think is really helpful in giving you a big picture background to this subject, because I think he makes a really important point in that video about moral philosophy. Because he says that people often assume that philosophers never make any progress and they're just constantly arguing about the same old stuff that they've been arguing about for thousands of years, blah, blah, blah. One person says one thing, another person says another. Who cares? What does it all matter? And he makes the point that actually this is totally untrue, especially when it comes to moral philosophy. When it comes to ethics, there's been a massive change in the way that people think about ethics and morality. And like everything else that I've been talking about in this series on rational thinking, the real turning point for this change was the Enlightenment, the period in the 18th century when rational thinking really broke through to become the dominant force in Western culture. And the point that Michael Huemer makes in this short video about moral philosophy is that the big change or progress that has occurred in moral philosophy can be summarized in 3 things. It's respect for the individual, it's an acceptance of the moral equality of all people, and thirdly, it's an increasing aversion to the use of violence in society. And all of these trends really came together in that period called the Enlightenment. And Michael Huemer uses a number of examples in his talk, and one of the key ones that he talks about is the example of slavery. The end of slavery is one of the most amazing transformations in human culture and in moral philosophy. Because historically, slavery was accepted in pretty much every single society and even accepted by the leading thinkers of Western philosophy and Western moral culture. The examples that Michael Huemer gives is that Aristotle wrote in justification of slavery. The Bible justified slavery. So Aristotle, possibly the leading person in Western philosophy before the Enlightenment, and the Bible, the leading source of moral instruction in Western culture before the Enlightenment. And during the Enlightenment, you had this move against slavery, anti-slavery movements, and that process has continued until slavery is now illegal in every country around the world. The last country to outlaw slavery was in 1980. So this is a huge change in the way that people view ethics or morality. In the ancient world, people accepted slavery. In a relatively short period of time, given human history, slavery has been abolished. And there are many other trends that reflect the way that moral philosophy has changed. People have changed their moral views, especially since the Enlightenment. The decline in war and the aversion to violence is another key example. And again, I've spoken about that in previous episodes, in particular, the episode that was a review of Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And the decline in torture and execution and general aversion to violence. You can see how people's views of violence and aggression have changed. And Michael Huemer asks a really interesting question about this. Why did this change in morality take place? Why was it so universal? And why did it happen so fast? In terms of human history, we had thousands of years of slavery, and then within a couple of hundred years, it's eliminated. And that's incredibly fast. Well, what does this tell us about morality? because there's all sorts of theories about morals. One useful tool that people use to understand humans is evolution and evolutionary psychology. But you can't use evolutionary explanations to explain this kind of moral change because it happened way too fast. These changes happen so quickly that you can't use evolution to explain them. They're far too quick for evolution to have played any role. Another explanation for moral rules and where they come from is a kind of cultural relativism explanation, which is just that, people just believe stuff because that's in their culture and they just go along with whatever the culture says. But you can't explain the changes that have happened since the Enlightenment with that kind of cultural relativist explanation, because that doesn't tell you why the whole world has moved away from slavery and towards more respect for individual rights. So Michael Huemer's point is that there's another kind of explanation, which he calls moral realism, which is to say the reason that people around the world have changed their moral codes away from slavery towards respect for human rights is because there is something objectively correct about those moral values. The moral realism argument is that there are objectively true ethics, and the reason that things changed so quickly is that people began to understand ethics more correctly. It was a revolution of ideas. And that is to say, it's possible to have objectively valid moral rules that you can determine through reason, through the power of reason, through rational thinking. And I agree with that. And that's what the 3-part series, Your Own Moral Compass, is all about, is about how do you determine objectively valid moral rules from invalid moral rules. So please do check out that series if you want to hear more details about how that all works in practice. Now, having emphasized what an amazing change the Enlightenment was in terms of the big picture of human history, we obviously don't live in a moral utopia. And during the last couple of 100 years since the Enlightenment, there have been many bad things happening. Wars, atrocities, violence, plunder, and so forth. And there's still a lot of confusion about morality. I do want to acknowledge that this is a very contentious and confusing and hotly debated topic. The idea of ethics and morality and where they come from and whether or not there can be such a thing as rational ethics or objective ethics is a hugely contentious subject. And despite the fact that the whole world has moved towards one set of ethical values, not uniformly and not consistently and with lots and lots of bad things happening as well, but in general, in historical terms, there's been this incredible progress since the Enlightenment. Despite that fact, there's still a lot of confusion and debate and argument over the whole field of moral philosophy. I think one of the reasons it's confused is because the Enlightenment itself wasn't a purely rational movement, and it was a movement within philosophy that had many internal contradictions and many confused ideas. And one of the biggest contradictions within the thinkers of the Enlightenment was their approach to ethics and moral rules. So in the rest of this episode, I just want to give you a bit of that background, just to give you a sort of framework for understanding how things got so messed up and so confused when it comes to moral philosophy. Because what happened in the Enlightenment was this move away from religion and towards reason and rationalism. And that includes in the area of moral philosophy. In Europe, before the Enlightenment, the most important influence on moral philosophy was the Christian religion, the church. And ultimately, that came down to moral rules based on the commandments of the church. The idea that, God says you should do this and you shouldn't do that. And that's the origin of where morality comes from. And of course, during the Enlightenment, people questioned that, and they questioned the whole idea of the church's authority. But in particular, the philosophers of the Enlightenment wanted reason to be their guide, and they wanted to understand ethics and moral rules not on the basis of what the church says or what God supposedly commands, but on the basis of reason, of rational thinking. And this kind of rationalist thinking had already started to develop before the Enlightenment, even within the church, with thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, who came up with the idea of natural law, still ultimately based on God, but embodied in objective rules. So there could be some objective rules that govern everyone because they are in the nature of what it means to be human, not just because God says so. And that idea really came to fruition during the Enlightenment. And you can see it in things like the Declaration of Independence, which is both a very clear example of Enlightenment thinking and also a very clear example of rationalist thinking. And it was very much based on natural law. The ideas in the Declaration of Independence were that all men are created equal and embodied with inalienable rights. So everyone has rights that are inalienable. And the Declaration of Independence basically made the argument that we decide to do things on the basis of reason. So the American revolutionaries essentially unsubscribed from the British government because they said, this government doesn't work for us. We don't have good reason for you to rule over us. So we're unsubscribing. Bye. It's an amazing statement of rational principles based on natural law. Now, this idea of natural law was really important in the philosophy of the Enlightenment because it was used to suggest that every single person could determine for themselves right and wrong based on objective principles that were in the nature of things. In other words, no longer did you have to appeal to the church. You could work out for yourself what was right and wrong, because right and wrong were embodied in the nature of things, not in what the church says. So that idea of natural law was very key and was deeply linked to the whole rationalist movement of the Enlightenment. But then an interesting thing happened with the Enlightenment, because a key part of the Enlightenment was a backlash against religion, against the kind of fundamentalist religion that had been very strong in Europe for over 1,000 years. And the Enlightenment thinkers were really trying to move away from religious explanations of things and towards more scientific explanations of things. And the problem that they had is that when they looked at this idea of natural law, that sounded to the Enlightenment thinkers as a kind of semi-religious concept, probably also because it's something that was originated by Thomas Aquinas, who was a very important religious thinker. So the philosophers of the Enlightenment became very skeptical of this idea of natural law, and they started to think that it was just a fiction. It was just another one of those made-up things that came along with all of the other superstitions involved in religion. And so they moved away from natural law. That immediately weakened the power of individuals to decide things for themselves, because it was that framework of natural law that had given people the ability to choose for themselves what is right and wrong based on reason. And in moving away from natural law, they got into a big open question, which was what to replace it with. Because if you don't rely on God to tell you what to do, and you don't think that there's a natural law that is discoverable by reason inherent in things, then how do you determine your own moral code? And this is where the thinkers of the Enlightenment kind of got lost. What came out of this was a whole number of different answers. One very important answer was utilitarianism, the idea that moral rules should be on the basis of the greatest good of the greatest number. And there are huge problems with that idea, huge logical problems. But I want to just emphasize a problem for ethics and for rational ethics. Because remember, the Enlightenment was a revolution in thinking to empower the individual. The idea was that you didn't have to rely on the church anymore. You could decide things for yourself using reason. You could act according to your own moral compass in harmony with all other reasonable people, because everyone would use reason, an objective standard. Now, with utilitarianism, you have to act according to the greatest good of the greatest number. And the question is, well, how are you supposed to know what that means as an individual trying to decide right from wrong for yourself? How are you supposed to know what the greatest good of the greatest number is? And the answer that tended to come up for thinkers after the Enlightenment was that an intellectual technocratic elite should be the ones to decide what needs to happen for the greatest good of society as a whole, and that you as an individual should do what the intellectuals say. So the revolution of thinking that was supposed to empower the individual ended up saying you should do what your intellectual betters tell you is in the interests of society as a whole. Ends up sounding very similar to you should do what the church tells you is right and wrong because God says so. But that was one very important idea that came out of the Enlightenment. Another thing that happened with the abandonment of natural law was that the Enlightenment tried to treat man-made law as valid just because it is something that we can observe sort of scientifically. The idea of legal positivism. So the judgment of law is not whether it's in accordance with some objective standard of right and wrong, but just whether or not it's carried out according to due procedure. And that really amounted to do whatever the law tells you to do because the law is right, which is very similar to saying do whatever God tells you to do because God is right. Both of these approaches moved away from the idea of reason and thinking rationally about ethics that had originally been very important in the Enlightenment. And another thing that came out of this was an overall skepticism about ethics and morality, and the idea that ethics are all just made-up ideas anyway. None of it's real. It's all just stuff that people tell you what to do or what's right or wrong, and none of it's objective at all. And a very, very important part of all this was the idea that the Enlightenment philosopher Hume had, that you can't get an ought from an is. That's the idea that there's no way to come up with moral rules just by observing the way that the world is. There's no logical leap that you can make from saying the world is like this and therefore we should do the following. So Enlightenment philosophy ended up in a bit of a mess when it comes to ethics and morality. Enlightenment thinkers really didn't resolve what to do about morality after getting rid of religion. They came up with these makeshift answers like utilitarianism and legal positivism, and they abandoned natural rights theory, and they ended up turning away from rational individuals thinking for themselves about ethics. The promise of the Enlightenment was that everyone would be able to solve problems like ethical questions using universal reason. You could do it for yourself. You could think for yourself. It was supposed to empower the individual. But after Enlightenment philosophers got lost on ethics, they ended up saying things like obey the law and do what your betters tell you to, because that is for the good of society as a whole. So in many ways, the Enlightenment turned its back on rational ethics. And there's been a lot of confusion about ethics in the years since then. And it meant that moral philosophy turned into a big mess, which it has been in for a long time. But it is possible to think rationally about ethics, and it is possible to use rational thinking to determine whether or not a moral law is valid or invalid. In particular, whether or not any moral law that anyone says to you is self-contradictory or logically inconsistent. You can use rationality to do that. So you don't actually have to get an ought from an is. You don't have to break that idea. You can accept that idea that Hume had and still use rational thinking to evaluate moral rules and to identify valid moral rules and invalid ones. And that's what the series Your Immoral Compass is all about, which I'll put a link in the show notes to. So if you want more detail about applying rational thinking to ethics, as I say, I've done that series on it. In this episode, I just wanted to give you a bit of that historical and philosophical background. I hope that's interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts and any questions that you have. That's all for this week. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.